Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, council. We have a work session tonight about short-term rentals. And I have just a handful of slides here. Sarah, if you go to the next slide for me, please. Wanted to provide just a quick bit of context. We're going to be talking about policy direction for those dedicated folks on the Planning Commission. They will get to go through this process one more time, as will we all. So the idea tonight is that hopefully there can be some consensus as to what the council would like to see in terms of draft legislation coming from the Planning Commission around what to do about short-term rental regulations. Mr. Vasilati, myself, and Karen have prepared a few slides just to kind of help grease the wheels, as it were, for this conversation. This has been a long process. We've been doing this for about a year and a half. I'm going to rehash some existing information. We also have some additional data to share with you all. I did email some of that to you earlier. We can also share over the screens with the folks here in attendance tonight. So I just wanted to walk through those, and then I will get the heck out of the way and y'all can talk. So would you go to the next one? Okay. So, and if Aaron, if I say anything incorrectly or you would like to supplement it, please, by all means, jump in. We often get inquiries for this data here. This is how many lots do we have by zone type? You'll see zone type there in that second row, almost a very, very, very light pistachio color. And how many lots developed and undeveloped in each type. This is to help you understand what the caps would look like. As you will recall, council, caps were a major part of the Planning Commission draft ordinance that came out. And so I have heard a little bit of interest from this board in possibly exploring that again. This is not to say we as staff are encouraging that one way or another. It's again for your just edification here. So currently we have 162 short-term rental licenses in our system. We feel pretty good about that number. We vetted that and scrubbed it. We also, you will see on here, there are X amount of lots by zone type. The ones I think probably garnering the most interest are SR, suburban residential, UR, urban residential, and then you see PUD, planned unit development, over on the far right, those zone types. And you'll see that there's 75 short-term rental units currently licensed in suburban, 46 in urban, and then 7 in planned unit development. And so how that equates to percentages based on developed lots, you will see down there at the bottom, 4% for suburban, 8% for urban, and 4% for planned unit development. So again, this is for context. This is where we are right now. The moratorium is in place. We will not have any new licenses. The current moratorium expires in late June. So if you would move forward, Sarah, please. And this is just an aid. You all have this in your packet. This is just to, if you do want to continue the caps discussion, this is just to help you out, kind of a sensitivity analysis. If you wanted to look at a cap percentage in a certain zone type, this is how it would equate in real numbers, just to kind of move past the whole more vague percentage numbers. This is a little bit easier to digest.
Michael,
so this is just to refer back. Yes.
Quick question. Is this based on developed lots or total lots?
This is developed lots, I believe.
Okay, thanks.
And it doesn't, in a lot of cases, I don't think it makes.
It may not make a difference. Yeah, just.
Yeah, very, very little. I'm pretty sure this is developed lots. If I'm wrong, it varies by 1 or 2. This is one you did not see earlier. This is something Aaron and I talked about earlier today. I found it fascinating and you all might find it helpful. We have 162 licenses that are currently authorized. They're not all active at the same time, at least not legally. These are the number of folks remitting lodging tax. Is that correct? Okay.
Each month.
Actively remitting lodging tax each month. This is if it's hard to read, it's 2021 on kind of the left half, 2022 on the right half. And you will see that it's been steadily climbing, but even in the busiest parts of the year in the summer, we're just barely above half of the total licenses being active. Yes.
Michael, when you said they're not all active at the same time legally, I thought 162 could all be operating.
So and that's fair. So they are legal
Oh,
and maybe they're just not operating. If they're operating, they should be remitting
all right.
lodging tax.
Well,
So-
it may be too that if in a perfect world, they are supposed to remit, if you have no revenue in a month, you're still supposed to remit a zero return.
Okay.
Okay, so you're required to remit a return each month, even though you don't remit any tax. So what this says to me is these are remittances of revenue. And so it's not counting zero returns.
That is correct.
So zero returns means they haven't had any rental activity with which to charge and remit sales tax or lodging tax.
Does this include the people that have submitted $0
It does.
remittances?
Yes.
Okay, so if taking the last 180 something, there are half of the people are not even remitting a zero if they're not active.
No, I'm sorry. I think I might have confused. So this is everyone who is remitting amounts.
Okay.
So the zeros have not been included in these numbers.
And zero means no rental,
Correct.
no activity.
So I just, there's a number of conclusions you could draw from this, because I just threw it in here. I haven't really digested that and presented it, but, there it is. So if the impression is all 162 are active all the time every month, that would not be correct based on what we're seeing. But just to give you maybe a baseline, the certain amount of activity you saw last month, for example, or a couple months ago, it'd roughly be about half of those licenses actually having activity.
Hmm.
So if we go
Can
to
I ask about, is there any enforcement for this?
enforcement,
To ensure that they're paying the taxes and the people who are supposed to be remitting, even zeros, are still remitting?
I would look at, I don't think so. I don't.
Is there any other business license that doesn't get examined or get skipped by when it comes to doing the right thing? Or is it just short-term rentals that are getting a pass?
No, they're all treated the same.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah. They get delinquency notices that are generated by the system. And
believe that, but
well, I did it and that's the process. So,
doesn't seem to think so, and he's running the city, so.
okay, well,
Are they actually sending out late notices and?
There's penalty and interest assessed if they don't remit in the right month.
Okay,
So- What this graph is showing is that the people may not be renting the property all 12 months. So-
I understand,
Okay.
but you should at least have the numbers up there that are properly remitting the paperwork every single month, which shows that they're still having an active license. That they should still have an active license. Is that not correct?
Understood.
So what you're showing up there is there's 82 people who aren't active and shouldn't have a license.
no, it's probably not have any business activity that month.
Understood.
So, and this
And
This
it
is-
happens commonly.
This is not to
Whatever
say
business.
short-term rentals are a problem or not. This is, my intent here truly is to show if you want to equate, you anecdotally, you see the activity in the community. This is how many are actually active. If there were more that were active, if there were more licenses, you're not going to see a 1-for-1 correlation, I guess. This is why we don't add slides usually at the last minute. But again, I thought it was helpful enough. I added it. It was me. It was not him. It was me. I thought, oh, this is really cool. This is interesting. We go to the next one, please, Sarah. Okay, so I also wanted to provide, Aaron put this together. Thank you, Aaron. An idea of what the city does generate from both lodging tax and sales tax from short-term rentals and lodging establishments. As the city manager, as your chief fiduciary agent, I want to make sure that if there is a policy direction that would eliminate some or all short-term rentals in any given zone type, there will be a financial impact to the city's operations. This is what it looks like for 2022. The next slide is the 2023 budget. So what I want to draw attention to is the bold numbers in we'll go with 2023. They're both pretty similar. Right. No, you're good. You're good. So for the short term, I was making enough. I'm wrong. Correct me, please. $250,000, $249,880 impact to lodging tax for the city. I think our lodging tax fund is doing about $430,000 a year. I know
That's correct.
Thereabouts.
It's a little more.
it's a little more than that. Okay.
So Michael.
Yeah.
That $249,880 residential lodging tax does not differentiate be somebody who is an owner occupied residential versus a non-owner occupied. Is there a way of
We're
understanding what that might
we're
look like?
working on that. We don't have that data. That's not a data point we've collected on the existing application. It's something we will put on a revised application. We've hesitated to roll that out because there's a lot of other things. The good neighbor guidelines, fees, penalty violations that go along with that application process. So we don't have a way to differentiate who's owner occupied, who's not. So, you know, if you all wanted to make sure that owner occupied can continue with no impediment at all, and they're half of the short-term rentals or half of this money, really, then, you know, that would decrease by half, that would, 125, whatever. But we don't know at this point because we have not asked that information. So if they all went away, they were, they were non-owner occupied, and that's how you wanted to roll hypothetically, that money would go away. Similarly, with sales tax, you would see about $88,000 go away. And it also impacts our streets fund, the 410 fund. That's what that is, to the tune of about $44,000. The school district, as you will recall, generates 1.09% sales tax. They would be impacted. I believe the county and the ambulance district would also be impacted to some arguably nominal degree, as would the state. So this, as your city manager, just want to put out there that there is a financial impact depending on which way the policy goes. Not abdicating one way or the other, but if some of these funds go away, we will have to reevaluate operations to accommodate. So that is all the point for this one.
Could I ask, our total budget for the city is 32, how much million?
35 million, I think, across.
What's
all
the
funds.
percentage of $250,000? What's that percentage loss when you're dealing with a budget that large? What's that percentage? It's less than.
I would qualify that because there are enterprise funds that are water and wastewater and the street capital improvement that are outside of the general revenues. So
And
a large part of our budget is the water and wastewater fund, and we really
how much of the
cannot
lodging
exclude those.
tax would it, how much would our school fund 410 and general fund increase if these were full-time residents in those houses? I don't see that information here.
I don't have that information.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think we have one or two more. Okay, so this is just a graphic representation of the ratio from short-term rental derived lodging tax from lodging establishment lodging tax and how that has changed over time. So you saw in the last slide, ratio was, can you go back real quick, Sarah? So roughly 60% of lodging tax is generated from short-term rentals, about 40% from lodging establishments. And so that change over time is what you see on the following slide. And that, I'm happy to answer questions. That's the last slide I have. Again, the idea here is to present some context from city staff perspective, some additional data that you all had asked for and might find helpful as you consider policy direction for planning commission.
Thank you, Michael.
Yep. And with that, I'm going to get the heck out of the way.
All right, let's go ahead and start with questions. I'm going to start with Rusty and we'll work on. Do you have any questions or comments for Michael on this? No.
Comments at the present time.
Okay. Did you have any questions or comments for Michael?
Not on the slides present,
Okay,
presented, no.
none. Kelly?
The only thing that I would say is just the point I was making earlier. There's staff that their job is to manage the sales tax collection system, similar to the utility billing system. And the delinquencies that's part of what they do during the rest of the month when it's not the 20th of the month and remittances are coming in for the prior month. So just so some insight into what they do is compliance and delinquency and collections. So just as similar to utility billing collections. That was my point. Thank you, Mayor.
On your on the remittance chart,
Yes, ma'am.
so that's clear. Okay. Robert, any questions on this?
No, my question was answered, and I think it is a data point that we will require in terms of owner occupied versus non-owner occupied. So whether we figure that out in the application process or by searching the data records and cross-checking signature, or not signatures, but ownership and address of mailing, I think that's probably.
So, and I had debated whether or not to bring forward our draft application at this point. It basically just asks, is how is this owner occupied or not, and how long are you in there? I don't know.
I think it'll ask if it's the primary residence.
Okay, so, and so we can begin issuing that. It will take us a little bit of time to spool up and make sure that we can take those and in a reasonable time process them. We just finished processing the last renewals, of which there were 160-ish. So it would take us a little bit of time, but we can roll that out. It would have existing owners filling out an additional application here in the next few months. We may come back to you, depending on the direction that you all want to go here in the coming weeks. We may come back to you with the other pieces associated with that application, including a fee. But we can also just do a no cost neutral $0 reapplication to gather that information, primarily to get that data point, if you all want to. Because that would be great data to have. So.
I hear someone's phone vibrating. All right, well, let's go ahead and try to get some consensus for what we would like to give the planning department direction to do. We are missing David, so if we can't come to a consensus overall, then perhaps we'll table if we end up not being able to come to consensus. So who would like to start?
Robert's got a good point. Let's go with his first.
No,
What was your thing you wanted to do? We had to come to a consensus.
Well, to work out what sort of financial implication this will have on the city from the data that Michael's presented to us. I think it's, from what I've heard on both sides of things, there is no desire to put any sort of restriction on owner occupied short-term rentals. So whichever way this goes, there's not a change in that. And those revenues would be continuing. So establishing and defining what that looks like, I think, is an important piece of the financial picture.
Can I just make one little point on that
Yeah, sure.
item right there?
Yeah.
I would just like to suggest that I still think, although there would be no restriction, no cap, none of those kinds of things on a owner occupied, I would still suggest that it would be the right thing to do for them to still apply for a license, to still have sign the affidavit for good neighbor policy. They still have to collect and remit sales and use and lodging tax those kinds of things, so that that whole administrative section of it should still be applicable. But then the regulatory, like if we were to cap something or ban something or whatever might come out of that discussion. But that they still need to be licensed and still be accountable for being a good neighbor, subject to violation, citation, things like that. Because it's not a free, I mean, they can't just misbehave. And so do you follow what I'm saying? And would you agree with that?
I agree with that in principle. I think another, and you brought up a second issue that, I mean, we can speak about it now or not, and that's the whole idea of the good neighbor policy. You know, we want to be mindful to not be over-regulating things we've already regulated, you know, so some of the things that are called good neighbor policy is really what's already in our ordinances and statutes now.
Sure.
So although it's nice to have it in one place to call it a good neighbor policy, we want to be careful not to be legislating on top of legislation of those things. So
I think it's, in my perspective anyway, I think
Yeah.
it would be more of an informational thing and an agreeing to these expectations of, and that would be then communicated with the guest. So that it's upfront what expectations are. It's not necessarily to be what's the word?
We weren't going to codify the good neighbor policy in the code. It's just a reference so that we can
With the
tweak it
license.
with the license. So it's not codified. So the code is still the code
Yeah.
for the nuisance ordinances and whatnot.
yeah,
Well,
It's
it's
more-
it's more information for the guests, because it has to be included in like the presentation that the owners give to their guests, because the guests aren't gonna know where to look for a statute or ordinance or, you know.
sure.
And I
Yeah.
think an important point is a good neighbor policy doesn't just apply to STR neighbors, it applies to all neighbors.
Everybody.
So that's why it's got to be codified in the code in general, instead of some separate legislative piece that applies just to a certain subclass. Good neighbors are good neighbors across the board. And we all subject to the same rules.
I think we're on the same page there. I mean, it can be easily accomplished with a, you know, what do you call it? A one sheet of paper that's laminated,
Part of
you
the,
know, and
the
it's
application
what's already,
process.
this is what exists in a city.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
then
let
it's all in
them,
one
let
spot.
everybody that is a
Everybody-
guest
Correct,
have access to hear our rules.
correct.
and it could be just an attachment and part of a packet with the licensing process. And it's just informational. We give away a lot of information to be helpful to our taxpayers already. Process, different things like that. So it's really just a communication tool. From what I see anyway. Instead of being
So
imposed.
before we go down the rabbit hole further with the good neighbor thing, the planning commission put that in their ordinance. And we would like them to keep it in their ordinance, is what I'm hearing, right? Because this is kind of to give direction to them too, so they know what they're doing when they meet. So, okay, so yay for good neighbor, keep that in. What's next? Robert was talking about trying to gather statistics. So that would be more of a city function. So they'll try to do something that they could include on the application where it says whether it's primary residence or not. I don't know. So Michael was talking about potentially doing a retroactive application with no fee, so we could figure out currently what we have going on.
Well, that whole area, when we did the renewal of the moratorium on the application, at that time, Michael had said to us, look, we need at least till, I think at that time it was February,
Mhm.
to get this exact sort of stuff into the application. Then we went on a whole thing to mess all that up. And so we didn't even get the application. So we had rushed back to applications. Applications were the old applications, and some of the data points we were hoping to get simply because of the new application form went by the wayside. So as we go into this process, you know, maybe some direction we could give to the city is be working on what that application looks like, because we're going to have to face the issue perhaps of the reviewing of the moratorium again by, what is it, June, what's the date? June 23rd. And it sure would be good to, on a parallel tangent, to have that handled.
Right, but the one issue will be, there's a strong potential there will be no new applications, or if there are, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4. And in the meantime, if you guys want to know who's primary now, so then I think we need to give direction to staff to do the retroactive application. Do we want to charge a fee for that though, or not? Because it is staff time, money and effort. I don't care either way. I'm neutral, but I would think not charging for it is the right thing to do, but I don't know how that impedes for staff time and effort.
Yeah, it is a fairly substantial lift for our staff to process those, so it will take time. In principle, I think charging the fee, the owners have already paid their
Right.
business license fee.
Right.
We have a kind of a working fee that we're thinking about kind of in the long term, but we would like to understand more for the permanent ordinance, what all goes into that in terms of enforcement and good neighbor guidelines. We've said all this many times before, but we want to kind of know the full boat of what we're charging back for before
Right.
rolling that out.
Right.
And so without having that, I would be a little hesitant to charge another fee,
Sure.
pro rata or not. And it would just be, get this back to us, you got to do it. And we won't charge you for it.
Okay.
It's just going to take our staff a little bit of time to process all those.
Okay. So do we have consensus from council for that? To gather
Mayor-
that data?
Mayor, don't
To
we
gather the
already,
data, yeah.
don't we already have allocated in the budget 40 grand or something for this sort of STR research? Isn't that already a budget
Yeah.
item? So can't
Yeah.
that just be absorbed out of there? In
It's-
terms of the,
Well,
Yeah, it depends on how the,
I thought we were
RFP
just
was
gonna
written.
update that anyway. Weren't we just gonna update that report? But didn't we
So-
already do a housing study that kind of touched on that?
So if I may, so
Yeah.
we are going to do a housing needs assessment anyway. We received a grant to do that. Some of it is coming out of the American Rescue Plan dollars, the rest of it. You all appropriated an additional $40,000 for an economic impact study related to short-term rentals. We have not initiated that yet. Again, because of a lot of the changes, we haven't done that. If you all want to get that going right now, we can do that. But with everything up in the air, we haven't done it. The $40,000 is a pretty honest estimate, excuse me, from about 6 months ago now, with inflation. But I wouldn't probably reallocate that money to something else because it would just go back to pay staff time anyway, and we don't. That's okay. It's, yeah. We're gonna spend it anyway. Is that how?
Well,
question.
I think the primary residence is such a big deal to some of you that we need to get it done. Because I don't want to keep furthering a moratorium or hindering planning commission if we don't have that information. So let's go ahead and get that done, so you guys can make a decision what to do with that information once you have it. Is that all right?
Mhm.
Okay. And it sounds like planning commission is gonna have to wait then potentially until you have that information so that you know what you want to do with it, right?
Let,
how you see that?
Well, because some of you only want primary residents allowed to have STRs, some of us don't. So that makes a huge difference in the type of ordinance that's going to be created. I mean, if 100 out of the 162 are primary residents, are you guys still gonna want to ban primary residents? I mean, not
Not primary.
non-residents or not, if it's, if 0.02% of owners are not primary residents, is that who's gonna get kicked out? Or not? So that ordinance, that answer alone should just stop this whole meeting and say, until you guys have that, we can't do anything. That's really what I think about this meeting. Because if that's the goal,
I
is to know
agree.
primary residents beyond anything else, then there's no point in continuing this meeting until they have that data. And there's no point in planning commission spinning their wheels until you know you're going to do something, whether you have that data or not. That's what I think.
I
And if
agree.
there's consensus to gather the data, then let's end this meeting, have the city gather the data, and then we can go from there.
Well, I want to make sure that you have consensus to gather the data, but that data is not really going to alter my position.
I know, it won't change some of our opinions.
Correct,
But it will change the direction of the ordinance and the meeting,
right.
because,
And it may change. It may change.
and it could change some other
It could.
people's opinions if they see that the majority of the STRs are owned by primary residents.
So my question is in order for us to determine whether it's a non-owner occupied or an owner occupied residence that is operating as a short-term rental, then that's going to require that to be communicated through the licensing process. I would hope that that's where we get that information. And then we enter that into our tax accounting software. And then as they file returns, we're able to see, and we get the licenses entered and they're licensed and in the system, then we can see who's primary and not primary. I don't know that that's necessarily a product of a housing study. I think that that's more a product of putting the administrative process in place in order to understand how each one of them are operating.
Right.
And then we can see what that ratio is, who's a primary and who's non-primary, right? Or if we decide that it's just going to be primary, then whoever we issue a license to will be primary and it'll be 100%. So that's how I see that data coming, is through the licensing process.
Well, that's how we'll retroactively retrieve it
Yeah,
anyhow. We can't get it any other way.
well, we
right
could
now.
survey who's in the database, the
Yeah.
162.
Wasn't part of the housing study idea, though, to figure out how much revenue they generate in the community versus not, or am I remembering incorrectly?
I asked the same
That,
thing.
that's part of it. Yeah,
It was,
that's
I
part
mean,
of
it was a
the
whole
broader-
packet, it was a whole
Yeah.
package deal, right? Of
Mhm.
primary resident, non-primary resident, how much revenue is really generated by STRs versus residents.
Right, and trying to approximate what would happen if
It's-
those
Right,
were
if they
owned
went-
by full-time residents.
Right.
Right.
Hold
To
on.
kind of figure that out.
Michael, are you going to
That's what
share
I've asked.
or
All right.
distribute the
I see.
RFP so we know what is in that housing study? So that if a council member thinks there might be a topic that was missed, we could suggest, hey, what does the council think about adding this piece of
Yeah,
information?
yeah, so I would say the housing needs assessment was something we were doing separately, and we're getting ready to interview firms for that next week. The economic impact study, just to differentiate, yeah, we can do that, absolutely.
Okay.
Well, you know, there's another part of this that it brings up, and that is about a month ago, I went and visited a friend of mine down in Green Mountain Falls. And I happened to notice across the street from his house, there was a sign posted of a hearing. So apparently in their neighborhoods, no matter what you have, whether you're owner occupied, non-owner occupied, you have to go before a hearing of your peers in your neighborhood to see whether they're okay with, and they have, I think, some pretty strict caps there. But you then have to persuade your neighbors that you having a short-term rental there is valid. So one of the other data points that's going to come out of this is we're going to see if we have homeowners who are permanent residents in that home, and whether we have a whole chain of them in an area or not. We haven't really worried about that at all, and I don't know that we're going to need to, but if other communities are looking at it on a every single one basis and having a hearing of their peers and of their neighbors, that's a pretty interesting look at what that means to the community.
How does that work?
You
Is
know,
that an HOA that's
No.
having the hearing? Who's holding the hearing?
The city,
Oh,
no,
I
but the
see.
town, I'm sorry,
I see.
the town.
I thought it was a neighborhood hearing.
No, well,
I see.
neighborhood, yes, you go to the hearing. The
And
town
people are
puts it
invited
on
to
and
come.
people, yes, to to speak for or against having that a short-term rental there.
Specifically the neighbors that live around.
People, surrounding that property, correct? So it
Sounds
goes
like
back
it's
to
coming
quality of life, quality of neighborhoods, which clearly the number of folks who
Who's gonna do
petitioned to
that?
have this rescinded. That's what they're speaking to. So as we look at all the pieces of this, it's important that we look at, having that data point has other things we could look at as well. That's what I'm saying.
Well.
That was actually gonna be one of my
I
questions is what else would you want to know if we did a new application? Are there any other things?
Where they are.
Yeah, well, that would
Different colored dots.
over which ones are owner occupied. I don't know.
Owner occupied versus.
Yeah, we could do that but are there any additional? Well, any additional data you would want? No.
Not necessarily data, but have we made the license more obvious as far as parcel address, mailing address, so that we
Yes, we
get the
have.
right addresses?
Yes,
Okay,
we've
that's-
made that much more clear
Okay,
in the
that was
draft.
my only issue.
It's a much more robust process and application.
Is that the same for all the lodging we have in town? Everything's the same.
This would be unique to short-term rentals. Lodging tax or lodging establishments would be just regular business licenses. I don't know if we have an additional license for,
I have no ordinance in place that separates either one of these.
It's a permitted, it's a hotel. It's in the table.
Frank, could you talk in your mic? Because I can't.
It was on. Yeah, no, we have a moratorium on Title 18 for our lodging for issuing short-term rentals. The hotels do not work outside of that. It's the same. So I'm trying to understand why there's a difference in how we fill out the forms for licenses and how that got changed without the city council being involved in it. Well, no, but our ordinances are certainly decided by us and the people who vote for us. And I'm concerned that we're once again changing something that us, the city council and the citizens have not allowed.
Karen, tell me about hotels that we have in our city. And are they licensed and they are in the table, correct? Of uses?
What do you mean by licensed? Or say that again, please?
I'm sorry. Our hotels that are operating, and an example would be Microtel Country Lodge.
Uh-huh.
And they are operating in a commercial zone.
Yep.
And they are operating under a zoning. Help me with the words, but in our table, there is a use that's permitted for hotels and in the commercial districts, correct? In the commercial zones.
Correct. I do not recall if it would have required a conditional use permit or if it was just flat out permitted. I could look that up for you. So there is the actual entitlement process to establish the use
Right,
on a specific piece of land. And then there is the annual business license,
right.
which is a mechanism by which the city keeps track of who is collecting
Yes.
lodging and sales tax.
Thank you.
So that Title 18, Section L, that deals with lodging is non-specific. It's for use only. It doesn't say whether it's commercial or non-commercial. It just tells you that lodging, the use, is only allowed in commercial zones. So I don't understand why there would be a difference in rulings for short-term rentals where clearly they're a lodging business. I mean, we've decided that.
Well,
We're
hang
trying to
on.
change the ordinance.
We also have people living in our hotels and motels with actual residential leases
Yeah,
developed
that's
by the
great.
managers. So,
Absolutely. They're also paying 30% building tax.
so,
On a single family home is only for something in this town.
but there's
So
actually.
there's not a fair, there's no fairness here. And for some reason, STRs are now treated different. And you're saying last 10 years, that still does not make it within code. That every one of them are non-compliant unless they're
Well,
in a commercial zone.
I think Frank, I think to clarify your argument is you feel the definition is different
Well, you
than,
can't define
than what's
lodging
being
any different
stated.
than what lodging is.
so.
But I'm befuddled to know what the difference of lodging is.
Sure.
So.
So anyhow,
Can we move on to maybe a different area of the proposed.
Please do.
And it's kind of tied into the word fairness that, because I look at the problem a little different than probably Frank and Robert. I took the oath to be constitutional, support the Constitution of the US and Colorado and the laws of our city. So I just, when I start thinking through this problem, and the fact that I believe in property owners' rights, that means that puts me smack dab in the middle between the anti-STR and the pro-STR, because both property owners have identical fundamental rights. There are three of them: acquire land, dispose of land, quiet enjoyment, or exclusive use, all part of that third piece. So we added, or we attempted to add, a way to protect the quiet enjoyment of the property owners that don't necessarily want STRs in there. And we had talked about a 2-strike rule. I think that is a very important piece of the legislation, in my opinion, because it follows the 14th Amendment's due process. You can't just take a use away from a property owner without following due process. And the 2-strike rule establishes a due process where you have factual information that says an entity has the right to reduce a use from that property owner.
Right, it's a
not
regulatory
arbitrary,
taking.
It's not
Yeah,
just, so that piece of the legislation, I would like to have a conversation whether we want to keep that in there to protect those that are neighbors of any STR that violates it, because we haven't closed the loop on that piece. We talked about the good neighbor policy, which applies to maybe the guests, but what is the penalty to a property owner when their guest violates it? We don't have any way of stripping a repetitive property owner who allows guests that are nuisance.
right. Or property owners, period.
Anybody, yeah.
I know. So,
So that part of the
well,
legislation.
that's part of creating this regulation for the STRs, is to have a consequence for running it poorly.
Correct.
So, but, and I understand what you're saying about, well, what about a property owner who just owns a property or has, their uncle comes over and they're a nuisance, but they get to keep their house and someone else doesn't. And it amounts to a regulatory taking is what ends up happening.
Well, yeah,
So-
and when you do the reading, that's exactly what it
Right,
is.
and what'll happen is, even if they have the 2 strikes and they're out and they have the hearings and say they're found guilty, they can still appeal those decisions to
I
a higher
like it.
court, and the higher court can find that it's a regulatory taking.
Correct.
And then the taxpayers will have to figure out how they're going to compensate that person for that home and business. It'll fall, all fault that happens that will be paid for, will ultimately be paid for by the taxpayer in the essence of a regulatory taking. So like if this council were to decide to ban non-owner occupied homes, an owner can bring a
Lawsuit.
takings case to the
Yes.
court, and the court can determine, and the taxpayers will pay that bill.
Correct.
That's what'll happen. Okay,
So
so,
hopefully this council has the wisdom to, whatever we do, we pass an ordinance that's going to minimize the exposure to the risk
yes,
of a lawsuit. That's my
Hopefully.
goal, is to
Right.
minimize the exposure to risk from
Right.
lawsuits.
yeah, and the whole thing about primary residence too is, well, if you guys want one that shows whether they're primary or non-owner occupied, I would like to know if the non-owner occupied are actually citizens of this community and county. I mean, if we're gonna do one, let's get down to the micro nutrients of all of it. Because are we gonna take homes away from people who are community members, but because they don't live in that home, they're not allowed to own it anymore?
We're not allowed to use it.
Yeah, see,
What in the world are you talking?
So, well, if we
If it takes
ban,
a-
if we ban If you
There's
look at
nobody
banning-
taking anybody's home.
Frank,
You're
please-
looking-
Staring.
please calm down.
I don't have to calm down.
Frank.
You People are
That's
making
true.
me feel.
You guys are
You're
asking
making
about
us-
keeping,
Nobody's taking anybody's. home.
you, Frank, you're
And you
asking to
share-
allow STRs for
Frank.
owner occupied only.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's
So-
my point. If they're
When
not
I said
owner
tell it now,
occupied,
Y'all said no, and now all of a sudden you're bringing that up.
if they're not owner occupied, but they are owned by citizens of this county,
Mhm.
are they going to be banned?
They're
So-
not allowed to have a short-term rental if they're not within the commercial zone.
So
Okay,
your
Frank,
answer is yes, they would be banned. So I would like to know how many people that would occur to.
Well,
So-
I
See, I separate the difference between what you're talking about, a complete loss, which is
It is
the
not
fifth.
a complete loss. The
Frank, would you let me
fourth-
finish a thought before you want to talk? I can yell as loud as you want to. If you want to behave, let me just talk. Just let me
Frank,
talk.
let Rusty talk.
let me
You keep
talk.
interrupting him though. You get fired up. It's an
You're
emotional topic
absolutely
for you.
And I'm
fired up
trying to be
because
nice,
You
Frank.
two put out information that is not correct.
I'm not putting out anything that's
Somebody needs to
incorrect.
stand up and say something, and that happens to be me.
That's not incorrect.
Oh, really? We
Frank,
just said
if it's
somebody's
an-
gonna get their house taken.
If they're a non-owner, if it is not owner occupied,
The
you,
city is not gonna go in and take their house.
Frank,
There is no ordinance.
I think you're misinterpreting what was said. Nobody is going to be doing a eminent domain takeover of
Right.
title and use.
it's a
That's the Fifth
regulatory
Amendment,
taking. There's
And
a
I'm not,
difference.
we're not going down that path. We're talking the 14th and I'm talking about due process, where both properties, yours next to mine. You have a right to quiet enjoyment. I have the right to quiet enjoyment under the United States notion of common law, free use. So you have to show through probable cause, facts, evidence that I have violated your quiet enjoyment. You can't just take and ban it. Otherwise, I can appeal to a court of law.
Well, currently, you are in violation, you're non-compliant.
Frank, would
Frank,
you mind
let's not
speaking
go
into your
down
microphone?
That path.
Because
please.
there's other people who are listening to this.
Yeah,
I'm done.
So
Well,
Rusty, go ahead and make your point.
my point is that I would like to see a discussion, a dialogue on the two-strike rule. Because it could pan out like you're expanding it more than just SDRs. I mean, the city does not have a way of holding a property owner accountable for keeping his guests
Well,
following the
this
good neighbor
ordinance,
rule.
that's what this ordinance would attempt to do.
would have.
And it would
attempted.
give the owner the due process.
That's my
So-
point. So I'm throwing out on the table, I would like to see that portion of 1431 kept. with the-
Yes, very
from the
good.
Planning Commission,
think-
and I'm hoping for a consensus that we would keep that piece where we can do something about bad STRs.
Right, absolutely.
But I don't
And I
know
would
the
agree with that.
council.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, the only thing is the original document had one strike. The planning
we-
commission was one, and then we went back and
Oh,
forth.
we
with
went
two-
back and
we-
forth. We had
With two,
two.
so I don't care which one we keep, if it's
A
one
warning
violation
and it-
or two.
Yeah,
like the
warning.
warning
the
and
next
then-
time you're gone. But at one time, it also talked about 3.
Right.
which
Well,
is
it
too
didn't,
many
it
to
it's-
me.
it didn't actually, I went back and read, it didn't say 3, it said 2 or more, so
Oh,
it'd be
okay.
3 or 4 or
Right.
5. So the two,
Two.
1 or 2 is fine with me.
I
would
like
hope we
the
could
2
get a
or more as
consensus
well.
Well, I mean, you
around
could do a
two.
warning and,
I thought that
Warning and
was,
you're gone.
that was reasonable.
yeah, which is fine. But
Well,
how
I
many-
think it has to be two valid
Cited
cited
violation.
violations. So it's not a warning and then a violation. Because that does not give you due process. So,
I felt the language was weak because what was in the other one, it just said 2 violations. It didn't, 2 substantiated violations. It didn't indicate whether a citation was issued or not. So you could have a violation substantiated by the police. In other words,
A Citation.
citation,
you-
yeah.
no, substantiated by code enforcement came over and they issue a warning. They don't actually write it up. But he has substantiated by issuing a warning that they were in violation.
well, I think
So this
substantiated
dialogue, we need to narrow
means,
it down to what words we
But-
put on the paper.
fine.
Is it a citation is issued or is it just an actual violation that might, under the police officer's subjective, he just gives a warning, but it was still a violation.
Well, and the other piece of the one we passed was the 2-year strike, was the 2-year, that has to stay if you're gonna do that.
Agreed,
You lose your license for 2 years
agreed,
because the original one has no
correct.
penalty.
And that's why I said 1431, the version we at the council had attempted to get through and keep in place, how we had tweaked that language.
And to kind of build on what Robert and I were talking about right away when we started was that process would be applicable to an owner occupied as well. If things were citable and there were violations of that nature, I would hope that that would be non-discriminatory
The way it was
and that
written.
it would be
Yeah, the way it was
It's
written,
written
it doesn't, the way it was
to
written,
that.
it doesn't specify owner
I agree.
occupied or non-owner occupied.
correct.
But the
Mayor?
one,
I just wanted to make that point.
yeah, the one thing I want to go
Which is
back to what you said at the very beginning was taking away a use. The one issue I have with that statement is this use isn't defined. So you're not taking away a use because it hasn't been a defined use.
Under free use, the term free
Well, you
use
do free-
constitutes.
you can do free use, but whether
That
we
means
like
any-
it, I get it, but whether we like it or not,
Still gotta abide by the.
we
code.
live in a zoned community.
I agree.
So it's a fine line that we have to walk. So you gotta, if the citizens want us to find the use as not allowed, we have to listen. I mean, I get both sides of the argument. I'm just saying zoning does matter and we live in a municipally zoned community. So we don't get to just do whatever we want with our property.
I agree.
So just,
But
Sure.
historical,
I'm
Pres-
just putting it out there.
I know,
Yeah.
Catherine, most of the zoning thing is based on historical precedents in why things have, why a use from a particular zone has been removed. And I think that somebody came up and said, well, you can put a rifle range in there, your backyard if it's free use. No, you can't, because it's nuisance and safety are the two due process foundations. You have to show that one in danger, that can cause you to lose your use. You can't have free use and put a rifle range. So almost every single zoning code, there's a rationale behind it. Because our constitution
They came
gonna-
from,
based on
they
free
came
use.
from experience.
I'm gonna go ahead and
Zoning
let Robert
came.
have a say.
Robert, because I
So,
really want this dialogue going, because I
well,
have talked about it.
thank you, Rusty. I'm struggling with what I saw you launch your discussion on. I see it as a false premise.
Okay.
It's a false premise. You're talking about 14th Amendment, you're talking about property rights. Catherine made it really clear that we have zoning laws in our city. It creates an orderly city. It's part of what we agree to in community to abide by. And you are saying, firstly, the first part of the false narrative is you're saying is anti-STR and pro-STR. I don't think anyone anywhere is anti-STRs. I think we all recognize there is a value and a need for STRs in Woodland Park. I think that's pretty fairly agreed to. What you have is those who want to follow the zoning laws as we have established them, and those who want to act outside of those zoning laws. And then if we were to make it all better, for lack of a more eloquent way of saying it, and we were to say, okay, we are going to include residential, commercial lodging properties in our residential zones as an acceptable use. Now we screw with the whole value of having our zoning in the first place. And it goes into everything that the citizens have cried out quite clearly, that there is a concern for the quality of life in the neighborhoods. So the legislative role we have doesn't violate. I don't think we have a situation where we're going to have lawsuits that violate what's in place. We have a very orderly society that we have established. You might agree with it, you might not, but it's very orderly. So the premise, firstly, is it's not anti-STRs. It's where they belong in context with the society we've established in Woodland Park.
Well,
This-
Robert,
would you agree? Would you agree with that?
Well, I use the term anti-pro. I'm trying to say that I am trying to come up with an ordinance or a position where I can support a vote, where I am dutifully trying to protect the people who want to ban, limit, control, take away a property owner's right to do an STR. At the same time, I'm also trying to protect the STR right to do an STR. So
see,
that's property rights on both sides.
It's not
That's what I'm
property
trying-
rights on both sides.
It
That's what
is.
I'm trying, I hoped I articulated to you. You have the right to do what you want with your property, yes. Then when you come out from your 40 acres out in the country and you come into the city, you are subject to the structure of what you've agreed to as a community to create in terms of your zones. So you've got hotels in commercial zones, you've got businesses in commercial zones, you've got residents in residential zones, you've got urban resident, you've got the zones that we have. It is not okay to assume that the property rights of somebody who has has purchased a residence, to say that and they don't live there, to say that they can conduct a lodging enterprise in it. You've got fire extinguishers, you've got handicap ramps, you've got health and safety inspections in the kitchens, you've got all the stuff that those who are regulated in the commercial zones are subject to. So you're assuming it's all right because I have this piece of property, I can do what I like with it. Well, that's not, in my opinion, that's not accurate.
Well, I think there's a little twist that makes it accurate. We are now talking about putting a new ordinance in place that will change a property's owner's current rights. Right now, they bought their house, they had rights. If the city does something that now causes damage to them, they do have the right to sue. Correct? Yes or no?
No, I don't
Any
think so.
zone-
I don't think so, Rusty. What you've got is,
Wait,
you've
Robert,
got the
anybody can
city's,
sue
the
any
city's authorized, just to follow your point, you can respond back after. The city has by lack of clarity, allowed licensing to collect lodging tax through a license process in an area that is not authorized in the use table. So you're saying that, okay, because it's not authorized in the use table, we're assuming it's okay for a property owner in a residential property owner who doesn't live there, who wants to make it a commercial use, it's okay because it's been a gray area for the city. I'm suggesting it's not in the use table. You can't assume it's in the use table. You can't assume rights in a use table. You can't assume rights in that property when by the definitions, it's not, it's a different type of enjoyment. It's a different type of use of that property than it is for residential use. So,
Okay.
So
Go
I'd
ahead.
like,
I'm not
can I-
eloquent.
I'm sorry, go
Let me
ahead.
finish. I'm not very eloquent. Here's what my reading has shown, because I've been reading court cases in Colorado. There's ambiguity, right? Our municipal code doesn't define STRs. It doesn't say they're permitted, not permitted. They're not in the permitted table. And our city attorney has said they're not prohibited. Our other city attorney has said they're not illegal. So ambiguous at best. We don't know what their category is, correct? Correct?
Because it hasn't been defined.
It hasn't been defined. And Frank thinks Frank believes that they are lodging in inns. Somebody else may think something else. A court case that is very germane to this very topic. Houston v. Wilson Mesa Ranch Association, where a homeowners challenged somebody doing an STR in their homeowners. That was the situation where commercial is not allowed. The Colorado Appellate Court said they don't change from residential to commercial simply because it's an STR, because the building, the dwelling is still providing residential use. It's just on a temporary basis, but it's still residential. They ruled that an STR does not make it commercial. So I hear what you're saying, but you keep saying, but we're putting commercial and residential. According to the Colorado court, and this is a 2015 case, that is not true. It's still residents in a residential zone.
But that,
Okay, so that's where I'm coming from in my mind. We can sit there and argue. You can have a whole bunch of people say, oh, you're reading it wrong. That's my interpretation of the case, and that's what the judges said. So it's a residential use in residential zones that is generating revenue, just like a long-term rental generates. It's not a commercial use, Robert. So we're not putting them in the wrong zones.
So
Now, if the Supreme Court, Colorado, wants to overturn that appellate court, then it's a different discussion. But as of right now, I can't find any case that says that it's commercial.
Check Santa Monica and the ninth.
I'm talking Colorado, Frank.
Ninth District Court.
Ninth
Right.
district
Frank,
doesn't
this is
rule over us.
Colorado.
doesn't rule over us.
It has nothing to
They
do with
don't
us.
have jurisdiction over us.
So
Well,
I just have
okay.
one thing I'd just like to
I'm sorry,
say
Kelly, I've been
in
talking too
to
much.
expand on the conversation is that I think where the potential for, if we were to ban, and this is just what I've thought through, is that if we were to ban them, we are turning against something that has occurred, whether it's in the code or not. And I think by omission doesn't mean that it's illegal. I think it's either permitted or not permitted by stating, by being
Well, if it's not permitted, it must be explicitly stated.
explicit. That's the word I'm looking for. And the thing is that these folks, and it's been going on for quite some time, whether the business license were issued without any substance in the use table or not, they've been issued and they have relied upon that. That's where I think that the issue comes, is they've relied on it for years, that what they're doing is okay. And whether it's wrong, right, or indifferent, and it shouldn't have happened or whatever, it happened. They've relied upon it and made quite an investment in a very expensive piece, an asset, relying on the fact that they thought that they were operating within the law. They're paying the taxes, they're collecting the taxes, and all of that. I think that's where there's a sticking point that we need to take into consideration in our decision process. Because I am with Hillary, and I've talked it over with folks that are more smarter than I am about the risk of taking a regulatory taking
Yeah.
by banning. And that concerns me, because that would be an imposition upon our taxpayers. It's not an imposition on me, although I am a taxpayer. I would be helping pay that bill. That could become an amazingly huge and expensive defense if that were to happen. And I'm not saying this out of fear. And I've always said that I would not make a decision because of fear of lawsuit. Wrong not to keep in mind in making our decision tonight, or not tonight, but in the future. And as we work through this, because it's the reliance that they were doing what they thought was okay
Mhm.
without any consequence.
Well,
So
I think there's
that's something to keep in mind. I'm not saying right, wrong, or indifferent.
Sure.
It's just something to keep in mind.
well, there's two sides to that coin, and
Okay.
that is let the buyer beware. And just because the buyer thinks it's okay, or there's not, it's like, okay, well, nobody's complaining here. You know, a train gets driven through there because of the unclarity. Absolutely. And I think we're seeing it not just in Woodland Park, but all over. And I think a lot of communities have said, wait a minute, this train's out of control. Let's take control of our own community. Let's decide what is best for our own community. And so, I mean, there's a classic example of a fellow who came and said he was off on a world cruise and was investing in property in Woodland Park, but at the beginning of the start of our process for what we're going to do with short-term rentals in Woodland Park. And then cried foul that, oh, I didn't know. It's like, that's what I call let the buyer beware. You need to do your due diligence. You do need to do your research. As a business owner, you look at the liabilities, you look at the risks, and you don't just go on the assumption of, oh, well, under good faith, this was the way it was. Well, if it changes, part of a business owner's process is to pivot. That's just what you do.
Robert, if you're talking about the person I think you are, he actually set up an appointment and came in and discussed whether it was allowed or not, and had met with the city staff and had been told, yep, because he started the acquisition prior to us actually engaging in the STR topic. And now, is it his responsibility to follow the news? Arguably, maybe, yes, no. But
Are the
I think
licenses still only a year? They're renewed
Business
every year?
license renew annually.
Yes, they are.
Are they
Yes, they are.
automatically renewed?
No,
So if that's the person, so there are situations that can kind of break that it doesn't make your argument valid, completely valid. You have.
I'm not an attorney.
Yep.
I'm up here to serve the citizens of Woodland Park. And I recognize we've got citizens on both sides of this issue.
Yep.
We also have folks on a side of this issue who are not part of Woodland Park and have had a loud voice in our determinations. And I have to sift out in my own what I'm hearing to recognize what do the citizens of Woodland Park want for the long range? What is best for Woodland Park to meet our needs, both for housing and for short-term accommodation and the need we have from the cyclical use of it. And what guards our quality of life. And that's a discussion that if we don't have as a council, I assure you, our citizens are waiting to make the decision for us. So you can choose, you can fight like crazy, but if you're not listening to what they're saying to you about the quality of enjoyment of life in the neighborhoods, I think you're going to just be spinning your wheels and wasting a lot of the council's time, the city staff's time, and the community's time, because they are a player at this table. And whether we choose to consider it tonight or down the road, I think they've already thought it through, and it might be kind of worth looking at, gee whiz, what are they saying? Let's look at what they're saying and let's say, can we go with this or can we not go with this? Is there enough workability in that for us to all get along, or is there not? And so, I just put that on the table.
Well,
Robert, I'm listening to the community as well, and I'm not hearing, it's not 100% that the message is what you're speaking. As I said at the last meeting, there are 8,200 people in this community, and my job is to listen to them all. And I have heard from a lot of people that haven't been in this room. I've encouraged them to be in this room. I've encouraged them to reach out to us. But I have to just say that I appreciate the process that's happened up to now. And I believe that it is our duty to create balance. And it is not all or nothing, and it is not one my way or the highway. It is about balance for all of our citizens in our community, all of them.
And Robert, I want to just say that I do agree with a large portion of what you said. We're here, we are representatives of the Woodland Parks voters, the residents here. So that's why I was willing to do some compromises on different things. Resident owned, I mean, everybody keeps talking owner occupied. I'm more focused on resident owned because I represent the residents. I really, I feel sorry for the people that are not residents. If there's a cap or a number that is put, then and they are excluded or eventually are phased out. But I have been listening to what the residents talk about. And if a cap will keep the character of Woodland Park right now the way it is, and then the only thing that can happen is it goes down. I mean, if it's capped, the only number of STRs you would have is a downward.
And it has gone downward from when we started this. It was
Yeah.
186 and now it's 162. So it is going down.
But it will eventually it will eventually plateau.
No,
And I would
cap is-
suggest that our demand
percentage-wise
is,
cap is a cap.
we're saturated.
Yeah, so if you're.
So
doing
I'm
four-
trying to keep it, the character right now of Woodland Park. And that's why, I was the one that made the motion for caps, what came out first. I am fully prepared to support a cap so long as that number starts with, we're not forcing somebody to lose it. Everybody, kind of like a grandfather, kind of a cap number. And then the only thing that would happen is it maintains that level. And as they lose their STR license from nuisance, the number goes down. There may be a waiting list that might bring it right back up to that same cap. But that cap, we cannot increase the percentage of STRs. And I'm willing to do that because I have heard the citizens. So I agree with what you're saying. We represent the citizens of Woodland Park, not Teller County or
Ellen-
California.
And this ordinance that the planning commission brought forward, which, to be perfectly honest, I only had a couple of small things that I really gave me a little bit of heartburn.
Mhm.
This was the product of a very lengthy public process.
Yeah.
And I attended those. I visited all the tables and listened to the conversations. And I feel like, this is the product of a public process that I think we should revisit. I think it's a very solid place to start with and use this as a template to work through as adults and as a council that's trying to work for the citizens and see if we can't find guidance in this for the planning commission to begin working. And I think that was what we were trying to do this evening. I don't know, that's just a thought. It's a place to start and have conversation.
Well, that was the purpose.
And so, and I think we've had good dialogue tonight. I really do. And we've shared some good thoughts for us all to consider in moving forward. And I'd just like to throw that out there and see if maybe that's a place to start for us. Instead of it all being in the air, bring it down to where we can maybe put something for direction for staff and the planning commission. Obviously, we have 35 minutes.
So
left.
may I? Yes, so I'm gonna throw something out there just on the cap idea. So we all have our versions on the caps, but one of the things I did recently was go crunch the numbers of the percentages that Michael put in his spreadsheet from a zoning perspective, from a straight up zoning perspective. And I'm not sure for me that I'm comfortable with just saying 4% in the SR, because if you go look at the map, Thunder Ridge, if you look at this of the subdivision, Thunder Ridge has 14% of their homes as STRs. My neighborhood has 3% or 4%. Hillary's has 6%. So maybe there's a way to do an overlay or some other way of addressing the caps where it's subdivision related versus just a zone instead of the whole town, because
yeah.
that's to
I see
me,
where
that's a
you're-
very, your neighborhood, I think I don't remember, I did figures. I did subdivisions that I knew Paradise is at 10%. So maybe there's a better way to address it rather than just say the whole
Yeah, I was
city.
gonna say that's not a bad idea because
not a
your
bad idea, Cap.
subdivision is different than mine.
Right, right.
I just like,
And mine.
And Frank's is the one with the most. Thunder Ridge is 14%. So I think,
That would
I
make
think that,
anybody upset.
I think that's, and then you could arguably throw in MFS and MFU if you wanted to, because it's the whole,
I hear you.
right? So that's just my direction. I mean, that's just my.
that's an outlet.
Well,
That is valid.
I'm
Thank you,
struggling
Kat.
a little bit with this whole idea of that we should go back to the planning commission's proposal because unless my memory is really bad, and it could be, I thought in the October 6th meeting, we brought the planning commission's proposed ordinance before council and we went, we don't like this, send it back. And it was our attorneys who said, please don't do that, tweak it, because if you don't tweak it, you're going to have to start over from the beginning. So for us to go back now to something we unanimously, it wasn't even like a split vote, it was unanimous. We said, we don't like this and we don't like the the caps. That's what we all said back then. So now you're talking about
I voted for it.
you're promoting that. What have I missed? Did
I
I
voted
forget
for
something?
it.
I
I'm
voted,
ready
I
to
voted
reconsider
for
it. I would like to
Robert, you're-
reconsider it and look at what the people have brought to us.
Robert, I think you're talking about the original one. And I think we're talking about the one that
This one.
actually had a motion and a vote.
Yeah.
Because we had tweaked that
Mhm.
heavily, correcting, in my opinion, all of the things that I thought was wrong. Yes, the first time. I mean, you and I spoke on the phone for hours about it. I've spoken to each.
We talked about it. too.
It just failed by one vote.
Yeah.
So
It's a place to start.
it's not the original planning commission
No.
one.
Correct. That's the one I'm talking about.
Michael shared it with us in his email.
And I think that was Kelly's point, was taking the one that had been voted on and failed by one vote.
See
And
if we can't make it
reviewing
work.
what could be tweaked to try to make it work rather than starting from scratch.
You know, what it might be a good idea is, Catherine has just thrown out a new thought where each subdivision.
Well, that's what I think like Avon and several other cities have done, the zoning overlay.
I like that.
And it shows what's allowed in each neighborhood. And then
mean, you were the
but
nose
you'd
of
need to gather
Would
the
you
data to
consider a
know
yes if we
precisely
pick a
what's there
subdivision?
now.
Depends on the public comment.
So it would also be,
So
I just value.
Oh,
the
also,
public
I forgot-
process That brought this to us.
I forgot to mention too, I know that there were some people who are aware this
Sure.
evening that we weren't
Trying to
doing
keep it
public
fair.
comment tonight, so.
There's someone on Zoom waiting if you could just say.
Yeah, see, I didn't
Okay.
even thought.
Yeah, and no Zoom comments
Right.
either. I'm sorry, I didn't announce that at the beginning. But you can stay for council and you can comment on items not on agenda,
Next to none.
so.
am I hearing correctly? You want to break it down not by zone type, but by neighborhood
Subdivision, kind of like an HOA.
subdivision,
It's almost like an HOA concept. A
And then-
homeowner's.
How,
and then
subdivision.
establish like
how many there are? There's,
Yeah,
all that is.
Frank, I didn't realize you were living in an area with 14%.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's not subdivision, maybe there's some way to do an overlay where you can take a portion of the subdivisions that are like 4 different subdivisions that all butt one against one another, right? Because like Foster's has like 6 subdivisions, but you could just say the Foster's track and lump them together somehow. Something along those.
I see Karen wanted to add something.
What you're struggling for was actually, well, no, and you might not like what I'm about to say, but the tool that has been used by a number of communities is that separation requirement between the placement of the STRs. And you may recall that that was in the recommendation the planning commission brought you, that when you've got one here, you need at least 500 feet or 300 or whatever the number is that
Right.
would be set by policy to have the distance separation between them.
But
You
how
can
do
make
you-
that number as big or as little as you want it to, but that is an effective tool without having to get into which subdivision,
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
there a better way to define it than we did in that ordinance? Because the 500 feet from the corner of the lot, that's really hard to
and an enforcement.
enforcement thing.
That,
too.
I mean, what does that look like from an enforcement perspective? That just seems to be random and outlandishly hard to enforce. And I'm asking that simply because I just want to know.
I've not ever had to enforce this before, so I do not know. I just don't know.
Okay. Just
That's
curious.
a good number.
You'd
I
have
could
to-
throw out a number too, 1,174.
You'd have to do
That's a
some
good
sort of a grandfathering right now because they are closer together. And that would really drive it to a best behavior thing, because as soon as somebody lost it, if they wouldn't be able to get it back. Well, I know you can't use the
Well, that becomes-
concept of a grant.
that also becomes an issue if it's primary residence. So only one person on the block who's a primary resident gets to have an STR and no one else does, but they're all primary
That's true.
residents.
So it's a
So-
two-edged, we've kept to look at.
Yeah. Well, there's another side of this that I think as far as a data point for the city would be good to have. And that is, okay, we want to find out how many are owner occupied STRs. But how about we find out how many non-owner occupied there are? I mean, by default, we might know that number, but it would be useful to know what that looks like. And yeah,
That'd be
and
math.
then put that in this map you're looking at in terms of each of the neighborhoods and get a sense of what that looks like.
Well, back to the original work session, we had the planning commission. I had asked for both owner occupied breakout, but I also wanted to know resident owned, because you could have a resident across the street that owns that property. He's
Yep.
not living in it. But if we're worried about maintaining it, keeping it character, he's as invested in that property as an owner occupied. So a resident owned property, I would like to see the number 2.
A third data point. Yeah,
Just another
Yeah.
data point.
yeah.
We already have.
Something else, council, that Michael shared with us is our community engagement report, which is a result of all of the work sessions and different meetings and discussions that happened with the community. It's interesting. I had a conversation with Arnie on Sunday, and he pointed out something that is challenging. And that's community character, which really did rank at the top of the concerns that came out of the survey and the questionnaire that went out. And so that's something that he also shared a definition that came out of, I can't cite it, but I have an email that I can share with the council. That is something that I think could be defined differently by each individual person that you would ever talk to, because it means
Absolutely.
something. It means something to me that very well may be different for you, Rusty,
Yep.
or all of you in the audience. But it is something that did come out. And I would just encourage you all to look at this again. I've been kind of skimming through it, but I intend to read it more carefully because it would be good in use in conjunction with what we're looking at and reconsidering this public input ordinance as a starting point.
Well,
So,
I'd like, go ahead.
sorry, I was gonna go
No,
back
you-
to something you had said earlier about we as a city have given the existing STR owners, owner occupied or non-owner occupied, the notion
We've
that it's
relied on-
okay, huh?
They've relied upon.
They've relied upon it, yeah. So one of the things that the citizens had said in the past was to not take that away from them. Legacy them, for the better lack of a word, right?
And that's,
Oh, I know.
it's another
It's not
conversation.
right- It's not the
I
right word,
know.
but I'm just, it
It's
was-
another
it's another
conversation.
Conversation but that's kind of that's where my brain went when you started saying.
Yeah.
What you were saying was,
Yeah.
well, okay, maybe this is a bridge, for better lack of a word. I don't know if it's the right answer, but it's something
It could be
it
a
could be a
compromise
compromise. And I'm
if
just.
during our
Right,
conversations and
right. So
deliberations.
That's where I just.
And these
wanted
are
to
all
throw
things that
throw
I've
that
been
out there.
thinking about.
Yeah.
When in talking with other people and folks from. And even with Arnie the other day, we had this conversation. So these are all things and ideas that I think will be constructive as we move through this and work through this. I don't think this is going to happen in one meeting. I don't think it's going to happen in 2. I appreciate the planning commission members in the back row that are here. Thank you. I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Well, if you're finished.
Please.
So, in terms of, I mean, it sounds like what we're doing here is kicking the ball around again, trying to get some texture to what it looks like,
Yeah.
going back and revisiting what the planning commission initially gave us, putting some changes, modifications, getting some data points together. I have before me a draft of what the citizens have put together of what they would like to see for this ordinance. I would suggest, I can make it digitally available to everybody for sure, but I would suggest that we include that in what goes to the planning commission. Because like you, Mayor Pro Tem Case, I too attended the planning commission discussions. And I was struck by how the citizens' input was mostly ignored. And that surprised me. It surprised me that that our planning commission wasn't listening to what they were saying to them when they were before them. I came before the planning commission at the time, and I was gratefully surprised that you guys listened to the suggestions that I had made. But I was just making them as a citizen, not as a council member. So I say that because in this ordinance is contained what the citizens, I mean, a large portion of our citizens are looking for. So if we include that in the discussions before the planning commission, it gives them their voice a fair shot.
I'm willing to consider anything, but I'd like to just be clear that when I say the citizens, I'm talking about the entire year or so and all of the public engagements that have occurred and the questionnaires and the entire process that we went through. That is the voice that I'm listening to as well. And
agreed.
because that was done intentionally and invited the folks in the community in many different areas to join us in making their voices heard. And it wasn't just one section or the other. It was a very well-balanced group that I saw when I attended as I walked around and listened. So I'm happy to take a look at that. Again, the citizens are a larger group.
Let me just recommend
People.
that if somebody gave that to you, they can give it to the planning commission too. And the planning commission
And to all
also
of us.
has public comment. And they are also all available to the public as well, just as we are. So, and if it's one thing that was given to you, I'm sure council would appreciate it being shared with us, but whoever gave it to you can also give it to the planning commission. I'm not going to send that as a recommendation to the planning commission.
No, but but in the same
It has to
way
be
that
vetted.
we
It
are,
has to be vetted.
Legality.
well, you haven't read it, so that's pretty,
Right.
that's pretty limited.
That's what I mean. Like, I haven't
Yeah.
even seen it. So to say today that that's gonna go, for
Right.
me, is not a,
Well, this is just about discussion here, and I'm simply putting it as a one more discussion point for us to consider on the table as we
Sure.
start looking, because the whole purpose of council having this meeting right now is to give direction, to give policy direction to the planning commission. And that's got some weight to it. So, the reason I suggest including this and it coming, and we don't have to make that decision tonight. I'm not suggesting we do. I'm putting it on the table as part of the discussion. So as we look to what we're sending to the planning commission, this is something that we've looked at.
I would suggest that
after
that
we
be
have the
shared to the
opportunity to look
staff
at it.
and to the whole council as part of the process. Because that's how it should be done. Because we have staff for that reason and it should come that direction and be part of the whole council seeing it and the staff.
Well,
That would be helpful.
this is an open discussion, but I would say to those who were in the audience who provided this, you've heard where they'd like it to go. So if you would please do so, that works, then they will have an opportunity to see it.
I'd love to see it. Thank you.
I'm sure all of council would. Council, do you have any further I don't know, planning commission, gentlemen back in the back. I'm not sure this has been very helpful for you guys this evening at all.
Stay tuned.
Sorry, Ken.
I was kind of hoping that we would have the previous ordinance that we could have worked off points of that from and gotten somewhere. But I don't think we're going to get anywhere with several members until staff is able to gather some of the data that's been requested. And planning commission, I'm afraid that we won't be able to get anywhere with you until they get the data that they're looking for from staff. And then potentially a decision can be made for a direction, I'm hoping, so.
Can, Larry, would you mind coming up? But as he comes up, can I ask one clarifying question that hopefully won't take too long, but in our application that we will ask, owner, non-owner occupied, we actually ask, is the unit your primary residence? And so we have it in Planning Commission's draft ordinance that a primary residence means a residence in which the usual place of return for housing and where a person lives and spends the majority of the time during the year as established by a series of different documents. A person may only have one primary residence the majority of the time in this dwelling. Is that satisfactory in terms of what you all
I think
understand?
legally it is satisfactory.
Data request, because I gave you a different one entirely. Resident.
Yeah, okay,
Of-
yes.
Of
yeah.
Woodland Park.
Yeah, of Woodland Park.
Right, yeah, so is this your primary residence?
Correct.
Are you a resident of Woodland Park? Do you want, if someone is not a resident of Woodland Park, would you inquire if they're a resident of Teller County?
No.
That was something
I
else that's
don't
come
need
up
that
at
'cause
some
I don't
point.
represent them.
I don't think so.
Okay,
I
That's
think our
helpful as well.
focus is Woodland Park.
Well, I think that primary residence is the only thing you want to know, or do you want to know if they're a citizen of Woodland Park?
I want
Resident.
would like to
Rusty
know both,
wants to know that.
Right,
Both.
okay.
please.
I'll support that.
What goes on your tax forms.
Correct.
you know,
Correct.
But Rusty wants a different data point than that.
He wants an extra one.
Yeah, he wants a different. data.
I'll support the extra one. Yeah.
okay. That
Okay.
is helpful.
Me too.
Sorry, Larry.
Okay.
Really, number one, appreciate the help taking the time and effort to provide us with policy direction. So important. And then as we go into the next step, that we have, so thank you very much. Number two is that we're very much aware of our role as a planning commission. Planning commission.
Michael, can we have new microphones, please?
Do I need to repeat?
Yes,
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead. How many people are online?
Number one, again, appreciate the city council fighting planning commission direction on this particular issue. Number two, we're very much aware of our role as a planning commission to vet this information, try to find out what these issues are, and to come up with a solid recommendation to give to you. Once you have that recommendation, please feel free to do several things with it. One, send it back for further clarification, or number two, modify that code. We did the best job that we could do to provide that. It's your responsibility to add that as to codify it and put it into the code. So those two things.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Okay. Michael, is there anything further you or staff needs from us?
so just kind of a heads up, thinking ahead toward dates that are important. Councilmember Nakai and I met earlier this week, and she kindly reminded me that hey, the moratorium expires June 23rd. And so for you all to have two readings, planning commission to have one or two bites at the apple at least, y'all would have to make a decision very quickly. If we are going to go and collect this data and then aggregate it for you,
You'll need time as well.
you will need to think about, and don't have to do it tonight, but y'all will want to think about that. And if you do extend it, how long might that be?
Well, maybe the next council meeting, we can have that as a discussion topic.
Mhm.
So that we can find out how long you guys may need and
Get a calendar.
And we can, yeah, we will have an estimate for you on how long it might take. We were already texting back and forth on just how exactly we're going to gather that data. We might be able to get it a little bit quicker depending on the method we use.
sure.
We'll try and expedite that, but there will be people who are on a cruise in Europe somewhere probably that won't get back, but we'll do our best.
Right?
Or however it went. But we'll come back with that.
Were you providing tickets? Is that what you're suggesting?
Only for me.
Voting records may be a start.
So,
For
but yeah,
people who
just,
can't read.
we will put that on the agenda for next time. We'll probably have a two item work session for you next time. You said it.
I really
I'm here
don't mean to
already.
be mean.
I'm here for a work session or I heard the mayor say agenda. Agenda item.
Agenda, okay,
discussion.
okay,
Okay, so
There.
not a work session.
okay, so we'll.
We
we'll
don't need
bring
a
it
work
under-
session for
Next
the
work session.
moratorium
Okay,
at all.
use,
That's easy.
okay. We will bring a draft and maybe some dates that we'll think about for y'all to pick at.
When's the next
Sounds
council
good.
election?
April 6th.
April 2024. Not that anyone's
has
counting.
anything to do with anything.
Okay, so if there's nothing further, then this work session is adjourned.
Is
Conversation.
there anything else? Yeah.